The tracks began at the tree line just before dawn. Fresh, deep, made by a man walking alone through new snow. They crossed the yard, climbed the porch steps, and stopped at the cabin door. There were no tracks leading away. The latch was still locked from the inside. The night before, nobody knew. That was the thing about it. The snow had come in quietly, a gray sky all afternoon, the temperature dropping, the particular stillness of air before a big snow, and the valley had gone about its business and gone to bed, and the snow had come down through the dark for hours and covered everything. By midnight, it was deep. By 3 a.m, when Florrie Pratt got up to check her sick animal, it had stopped. She did not look toward the Aldred clearing from her window. There was no reason to. It was dark and cold, and she was tired, and her mind was on the animal. She did what needed doing and went back to bed. Whatever crossed the Aldred yard that night, crossed it some time in those hours between the snow stopping and the first gray light. In the dark, in the cold, in the silence of a December night in the Ozark hill country, where the only sounds were the creek and the wind in the upper branches and the occasional call of a thing that hunted in the dark. In those hours, a single set of tracks was laid down in clean snow. One set going in, none coming out. Whatever it was that crossed that yard, it crossed it alone and in silence and with complete certainty about where it was going, and it did not come back out the way it came in. And by morning there was nothing left to say what it had been except the prints themselves, which said only that it had walked like a man, and had come from the north, and had gone to the door. Clem Poole found them at first light. He had come down from the Ridge Road on his way to check his own trap line, not going to the Aldred place specifically, just passing it, the way you passed most places in the Ozark hill country in winter, because the roads were few and the land arranged itself so that most paths eventually ran by most neighbors. He saw the tracks from 50 yards out and pulled his horse up. He sat and looked at them from the road for a moment. The morning was still and cold, the sky flat gray after a heavy snow. The trees along the ridge were loaded white, and the clearing ahead was unbroken except for what he was looking at. His horse blew a long breath and was still. Clem had been in this country long enough to read snow the way other men read print. He knew the difference between tracks that were hours old and tracks that were fresh, and between something that had fallen from a tree and something that had walked. What he was looking at had walked. The snow had come overnight, 8 inches, new and clean. Anything in the snow had happened after dark. Anything in the snow was recent. He rode to the gate and got down. The tracks started at the tree line. That was the first thing he fixed in his mind. Not from the road. Not from the direction of the nearest neighbor. From the trees, from inside the timber at the north edge of the Aldred clearing, where the darkness of the woods gave way to the open yard. One set, a man's boot. The stride was regular, not hurried, not limping. A man walking at an ordinary pace, crossing the open yard toward the cabin. Clem followed the tracks with his eyes. Across the yard, up the porch steps, to the door. That was where they ended. He stood at the gate and looked at the porch for a while. The door was closed. The windows were dark. No smoke from the chimney. Gideon Aldred had not been seen in 6 days. That was the other thing. Gideon Aldred was a trapper, 40-some years old, who had worked the hill country north of the valley for most of his adult life. He was a solitary man, but not a reclusive one. He came to town for supplies, traded at the mill, showed up at church services when the weather permitted. People knew him the way they knew most backcountry men, by sight, by reputation, by the things he brought in and the things he paid for. Not intimately, but reliably. He was a fixture. He had not been to town in 6 days. That was not itself unusual for a trapper in winter. 6 days in the hills was nothing, especially when the snow was right and the lines were running well. But his nearest neighbor, a woman named Florrie Pratt, who lived a mile east, had said she hadn't seen smoke from his chimney in 3 days. And a neighbor who worked a trap line north of the property had heard 2 weeks back that Gideon had gone farther upriver than usual, up to the Cutter Branch drainage, hard country, narrow draws and steep ridges, the kind of place where a man alone could get into difficulty. That neighbor had also said, quieter, that there had been talk of ice on the river above the bend. Clem stood at the gate and thought about all of this. Gideon was not a careless man, not the kind who made the mistake that got you killed in country he'd worked for 20 years, and he was the kind of man who came home. Regular, reliable, his cabin his in the way that some men's places simply were. If he was still alive, he would have come home by the road. He would have knocked at Florrie Pratt's place for coffee. He would not have arrived in the dark, in silence, leaving no prints from any direction a living man might have walked. Then he tied his horse and walked up to the porch. He looked at the tracks more carefully from close up. The boot was a man's, or right size for Gideon. Not that Clem knew Gideon's boot size exactly, but the proportion was right for a man of that height and build. The stride was about right, too. He had walked beside Gideon on a deer drive 2 autumns back, and remembered the particular length of his step. He crouched beside the last track, the final right footprint, just at the base of the porch steps, and studied it. The print was sharp-edged, not melted or softened, made in the dark after the snow stopped, which meant somewhere in the last 4 hours of the night. He looked at the porch itself. The boards were swept with snow, and in the snow on the porch there were the continuation of the prints, up the 2 steps, across the porch floor to the door. He could see the tread pattern clearly in the undisturbed snow. At the door, the prints stopped. He stood up and put his hand on the door latch. Locked. He tried again. The latch did not move. He put his shoulder against the door and pushed. Nothing. Not the give of a door that was simply latched, but the solid resistance of a door that was barred from the other side. He stepped back. He looked at the windows. Both were dark. The frost on the inside of the glass was thick. He could see it from the porch, the bloom of it on the inner face of each pane. Interior frost meant the cabin had been cold for some time, long enough for the glass to chill from the inside, long enough for a fire to have gone completely out. He looked one more time at the tracks in the snow, at their single-minded path from the tree line to the door, at the absolute absence of any corresponding return. Then he went back to his horse and rode for help. By mid-morning, there were 5 men in the Aldred yard. He brought 3 men from the nearest farms along the ridge road. Florrie Pratt herself had come too, which none of them had expected. She had pulled on her coat without being asked, and climbed onto her horse, and none of them had said anything about it. They stood in the yard and looked at the tracks. Nobody spoke for a moment. The tracks were exactly as Clem had described them. If anything, they were more striking now in the full morning light, clean and precise in the fresh snow, the tread pattern clear, the stride regular. A man who knew where he was going, a man who had arrived. "You sure the door's barred?" one of the men said. "Barred from the inside," Clem said. "Something solid on the other side." The man tried it himself. Both hands, full weight. It didn't move. Another had been walking the perimeter. "Nothing," he said, coming back. "No tracks anywhere on this property except the ones going to the front door." Florrie Pratt was standing near the porch steps. She was looking at the tracks with the particular focused attention of someone reading something difficult. "The snow stopped around 3 this morning," she said. "I was up with a sick animal. I heard it stop." The men looked at her. "So whatever made these came here between 3 and first light," she said. 4 hours, maybe 5. "In the dark," one of them said. "In the dark," she said. "Yes." They looked at the tracks. "It knew where it was going," Clem said. They forced the door. Now one of the men had brought a short-handled axe, and they used it on the bar bracket, worked the blade in at the gap and levered until the bar lifted out of the cradle on the inside. It took longer than it should have. The bar was solid oak, well fitted, the work of a man who built things to last. It hadn't been put up in a hurry. It had been put up deliberately, the way you barred a door at the end of a night. The door swung open. The cold that came out of the cabin was the kind of cold that had been sitting in a closed space for days. Not just winter cold, the specific cold of a place that had lost all of its heat. Deep. Still. The cold of a sealed room where nothing had moved and nothing had burned, and the warmth had bled out through the walls and the floor over a long time. The cold of emptiness. They stood in the doorway for a moment. In Clem's experience, most cabins smelled of something when you opened them. Smoke, food, oil, the particular smell of whatever animal had made its way in during the cold. This cabin smelled of nothing. Just cold air and old wood. The absence of smell was its own thing. They went in. The cabin was one room. A fireplace on the north wall, cold and gray, no ash from any recent fire. Just the old ash that had been there when the last fire went out, however many days ago. A table in the center of the room with 2 chairs, a sleeping platform along the east wall, a shelf with stores, flour, salt, dried beans, and on the shelf, a lantern, cold. The table was set for 2. 2 plates set across from each other, cups beside them. The chair on the far side pulled back at an angle, as if someone had recently stood up from it. One plate held food, dried out now, meat and biscuit that had sat untouched for days. The other plate was empty. They stood around the table without speaking for a moment. Clem looked at the plate with food on it, at the fork beside it, at the particular stillness of a meal that had been set out and had sat undisturbed for days, the food dried and stiff, the cup empty. Someone had set this out, had arranged it with the care you arranged a table when you were expecting to sit down to it. He was expecting someone, one of them said. Or had someone, Florrie said. She was looking at the floor near the door. She crouched down. "There's water here," she said. "On the floor, just inside the door." The men looked. The floorboards near the threshold were darker than the rest, a puddle that had dried at the edges and was still slightly damp at the center. The shape of it was irregular, about the size of 2 boot prints, close together the way a man stood when he had just come in and stopped. Melted snow. "Someone came in," Clem said. "The snow on their boots melted when they stepped inside." He stopped. "The cabin has been cold for days," one of the men said. It was cold when we arrived, Clem said. We don't know when the snow melted. And sat at the table, he said. And then he stopped. Nobody finished it. They stood in the cold cabin with the set table and the 2 plates and the melted snow near the door, and nobody said the obvious thing, which was that this had the quality of a homecoming, of someone arriving and setting themselves down in their own place after a long time away, of a man coming into his own cabin and sitting at his own table, a man who had not been here for weeks, a man who had gone through the ice in November. Nobody said it, but they all stood there thinking it, in the cold and the quiet, with the frost on the windows and the warm floor they hadn't found yet. They searched the cabin. Under the sleeping platform, Clem found a glove. A single glove, right hand, the kind a man wore for outdoor work. Heavy leather, worn at the palm. It was wet. Not damp. Wet as if it had been in snow and brought inside recently. He held it up. The men looked at it. That's Gideon's, Florrie said without hesitation. The stitching on the thumb. He did that himself, where it tore. I watched him do it. They looked at the glove, at the hand repair on the thumb seam, uneven but firm. One glove. Wet, under the bed. Where's the other one? Someone said. Nobody had an answer. They went back outside. One of the men walked the whole property, the wood shed, the outhouse, the small paddock where Gideon kept a mule. The mule was gone, which could mean anything. Nothing, he said, coming back. The only tracks on this property are the ones going to the front door. Someone pointed at the windows. The frost, on the inside of the glass, that's a room where someone was breathing. Was, one of them said. Or is, Florrie said. They looked at her. We haven't found a body, she said. We haven't found Gideon. We haven't found any explanation. She looked at the frosted glass. We don't know what tents we're using yet. The search of the surrounding woods found nothing. That was almost as strange as the tracks. They split up. Clem took the north timber, the section the tracks had come from, while the others worked east and south. They went in deep past where the light thinned under the canopy, into the hollow where the cedar grew thick. They found nothing. No camp, no pack, no gear dropped and left. No spot where a man had bedded down or made a fire or stopped to rest. The snow under the trees was undisturbed everywhere they went. The particular undisturbed quality of snow that had drifted down through bare branches and settled and been touched by nothing since. In the north timber, at the edge of the clearing, they found where the tracks began. That was the strangest part. Clem crouched over the first print, the left foot, which was the leading step, and looked at the snow behind it. Nothing. Not a continuation going deeper into the timber. Not a trail coming in from farther north. Just a first step, pressed into the snow, with no second step before it. As if the man had appeared at that spot already walking. As if the timber behind the first print was not the direction he had come from, but simply the place where he had started to exist. Clem looked at the timber beyond the first print for a long time. The trees stood dark and silent in the cold. The snow was clean in every direction. He did not go deeper. He came back to the clearing and told the others what he had found. Another man had circled north and come up against the same wall. The tracks began. They did not arrive. A man has to come from somewhere, one of them said. He doesn't just start. No, Clem said. He doesn't. They stood at the edge of the clearing, looking back at the cabin. Nobody said the rest of it. They went back to the yard. It was the night between the first and second day that one of the men said something. They were at Florrie's house. She'd offered coffee and a fire, and none of them had refused. They were around her kitchen table, not talking much, when he said, "I heard knocking last night." The room was quiet. "What kind of knocking?" Clem said. "Just knocking. At a door. I thought I was dreaming. I was half asleep." He looked at the table. "But I woke up and I lay there listening, and it didn't repeat. And then I couldn't remember if I'd actually heard it or only dreamed it." "What time?" someone said. "I don't know. Before first light. An hour before, maybe." Which was the same window. Which was when the tracks had been made. "Which direction?" Clem said. "That's the thing," he said. "I don't know. I was asleep. I woke up with the sense of it. The sound of knocking." He paused. "And then it was quiet." They sat around Florrie's table, and the fire burned, and outside the Ozark hills were dark and cold under the cleared sky. "He knocked," Florrie said quietly, "before he went in." Nobody asked what she meant by that. It was one of the men who remembered the other thing. They were standing in the yard, mid-afternoon, when he said, "There was a trapper died upriver. 2 weeks ago, maybe more. Somebody came through from the Cutter Branch country. Said a man had gone through the ice." He paused. "I assumed it was nobody I knew." Another man looked at the ground. He had heard the same story, the same description. Trapper, alone, Gideon's size and age. He hadn't said anything because he hadn't known for certain. Florrie was looking at the tracks. "The Cutter Branch drainage," she said. "That's north. The tree line these tracks come from is the north edge of the clearing." Nobody said anything. "Gideon's dead," one of the men said. Low, not a statement exactly. "We don't know that. We don't know it was him." Clem was looking at the tracks. He had been thinking about something since morning, since he had crouched beside that last boot print and studied its sharp, clean edges. He had been turning it over and not quite bringing it all the way into the light. He brought it forward now. "These tracks," he said. "The last print is sharp, not melted, made in the last few hours before dawn." He paused. "Gideon, if the story's right, went through the ice 2 weeks ago." No one answered. "In 2 weeks," Clem said, "a man in that river wouldn't come back." The silence that followed had a particular quality, the kind that came when something had been said that couldn't be unsaid, that organized everything else around it. Nobody looked at each other. They all looked at the tracks instead. Not impossible if the man was living. Impossible if he was not. "Then who walked to that door?" someone said. "In the dark, after the snow stopped." Nobody answered. They heard it just before dark. They had been in the yard, getting ready to leave. The search of the nearby woods had found nothing. The light was going. The cold was settling in hard, and there was nothing more to do that day. They were at the horses. Clem had his foot in the stirrup, and from inside the cabin, from inside the locked, barred, empty cabin, there was a sound. Not a voice, not a crash. Something quieter than that. Something like movement, like weight shifting on a floorboard. Once. They all heard it. Clem knew they all heard it, because nobody moved for a full 5 seconds. 5 people standing completely still in the cold yard, horses included, all of them oriented toward the cabin. Then the dog stood up. It had been lying near the gate all afternoon, refusing to come closer. Now it faced the door, and made a low sound deep in its chest. Not aggression, recognition. They all looked at the dog. The dog did not look at them. It kept its eyes on the door. Nobody said anything for a moment. My father's dog did the same thing, Florrie said. After he died, it would go to the door of his room and just stand there. Nobody asked what she meant by that. Clem took his foot out of the stirrup and crossed the yard. They went back inside. The cabin was empty. They went through every corner, under the sleeping platform, behind the door, in the wood box. Nothing. No one. The cabin was exactly as they had left it. The set table, the pulled-out chair, the cold fireplace, except the floor near the fireplace. One of the men put his hand flat on the floorboards near the hearth and held it there. "Come here," he said. Clem crouched beside him. He put his own hand on the floor. The boards were warm. Not warm like a fire that had just gone out. Not the residual warmth of coals. There had been no fire. The ash was old and cold, and they had all seen that. The ash was days old at minimum, gray and flat and settled, with no heat in it whatsoever. But the boards directly in front of the hearth were warm. Not room temperature warm, body warm. The warmth of a surface that had been in contact with heat for an extended period. The way the floor in front of a long fire stayed warm after the fire went out. The way the seat of a chair was warm when someone had been sitting in it. Like someone had been sitting in front of this fireplace. For hours. Florrie put her hand on the floor. "There's no source," she said. "No fire, no coals. That ash is days old. Whatever was in here, it was warm itself." Clem stood up. "There's no one here," someone said from the doorway. "I checked every inch." "I know," Clem said. He looked around the cabin, at the table with its 2 plates, at the chair still pulled back at an angle, at the wet glove they had left on the table, at the place on the floor near the door where the snow had melted and dried and was now just a slightly darker stain on the wood. He walked to the window. He put his hand on the glass. The frost on the inside, the thick crystalline bloom they had all commented on, had thinned. Not gone, but thinner than it had been when they arrived that morning. Like the room had been warmer recently, and the frost was retreating. He took his hand away. He looked at Florrie, who was standing near the fireplace, looking at the floor where the warmth was. She put her hand flat on the boards. She held it there. She looked up at Clem and said nothing. He thought about what she had said earlier. "We don't know what tents we're using yet." He looked at the warm floor in front of the cold hearth. He didn't know what tents to use either. "We should go," one of the men said from near the door. His voice was level. They left before dark. Before they left, Clem walked to the edge of the north timber one more time. He stood at the tree line and looked back at the cabin across the white yard. The tracks came from just behind where he was standing, from this exact place, or close to it. He looked at the ground around his feet. The snow was undisturbed. He looked up into the trees. The timber was dark and close, the branches bare above and cedar thick below, the ground in there nearly black with shadow even in the late afternoon. A man could stand 10 feet into that timber and be invisible from the yard. He had spent the better part of an afternoon trying to find where the tracks had come from, and he had found nothing. No trail leading in from the north. No tracks arriving from the river direction, which would have been the way from the Cutter Branch drainage, where Gideon had been working. No sign of any person having moved through those woods at all, in either direction. Just the starting point. Just the first step. He turned and looked at the cabin. Gideon had known this property for 20 years, had walked this yard in every season and every kind of weather, had pushed through that timber to the north on his way to his trap lines so many times that the path was probably worn into him somewhere deeper than memory. A man that familiar with a piece of ground might walk it in the dark without thinking, might find his way home by some interior compass that didn't need eyes. Clem thought about that. He thought about the river, about ice giving way, about the particular violence and cold of that, and how long it lasted and what came after. He thought about the tracks starting where they started, with no arrival, just a first step, already walking, already headed home. He went back to his horse. Clem went back the following morning. Alone. He didn't tell anyone he was going. He told his wife he was checking his trap line, which was true, but the trap line was not why he went that direction. He rode to the gate and stopped. The snow that had fallen overnight had covered the yard completely. 4 new inches, clean and undisturbed, the cabin sitting in the white clearing exactly as it had sat before the first tracks appeared, as if nothing had ever happened. He got down from his horse. He walked to the porch. He tried the door. It was barred from the inside. He stood on the porch for a long time. He put his hand on the wood of the door. Cold. Just cold. He looked at the new snow on the porch boards. Undisturbed, except for his own prints coming up the steps. He stood there for a while and thought about what he knew and what he didn't know. Nobody had entered the cabin after they left. The bar was up. It had been up all night in an empty cabin after 5 people had gone through every inch of it and found no one. He took his hand off the door. He went back to his horse. He told people about it when it seemed useful, and was quiet about it when it didn't. And over time, the 2 versions, the first day with its tracks and its warm floor, and the morning after with its barred door and its clean snow, became a single story that the valley held the way you held anything important. Carefully, without squeezing, letting it be what it was. The snow came again that night. By morning, it had covered the tracks entirely, the path from the tree line to the door, the marks on the porch, all of it buried under 4 new inches. The yard was blank and white and undisturbed. Clem rode out and looked at it from the gate. Clean, empty, just a cabin in a clearing in winter. He rode to town and filed what he could. The official record said, missing, presumed dead, circumstances unknown. He did not file what he knew about the tracks. That stayed in the country where it happened, the way those things did, quietly, person to person, without embellishment. They found Gideon in the spring, or rather, they found what the river gave back in the spring thaw, which was not much, enough to confirm the story, enough to put a date on it, roughly, and to establish that the man their neighbor had heard about in the Cutter Branch country had been, in fact, Gideon Aldred. He had gone through the ice on the river in late November. The tracks in the snow at his cabin had been made in late December, 5 weeks after. The people who knew this held it the way you held things in that country, not dismissing it, not explaining it, not making it into something it wasn't, just holding it. The fact of it alongside the other facts, the clean snow and the single path from the north timber to the door, the absolute absence of tracks returning, the table set for 2, 1 plate with food, 1 empty, the chair pulled back at an angle, The melted snow near the threshold that had dried while they were standing in the yard. The frost on the windows, thinner at the end of the day than at the beginning. The warm floor in front of the cold hearth. The wet glove that had been Gideon's, that someone had taken off and left under the bed. The sound from inside the empty cabin, the single creak of weight on a floorboard, that every one of them had heard clearly before. The dog stood up and made that low, continuous sound in its chest. All of it, together. A picture that had no ordinary frame. They held it. Florrie Pratt never talked about it much. She had been the one who said, "We don't know what tense we're using yet," and she seemed to feel that was sufficient. She had known Gideon for 20 years. She had seen his glove and recognized the stitching on the thumb. She did one thing that spring that she told no one about at the time. She rode to the Aldred cabin on a morning in April when the snow was gone and the ground was soft and green. She went inside. She set the bar back in its bracket on the back of the door. Gently, the way you did a thing you wanted to do right. She straightened the table. She put the 2 plates back where they had been. She walked to the hearth. She stood in front of it for a moment. Then she left and barred the door from the outside on her way out and rode home. She told Clem about it years later. "Why?" he asked. "He came all that way to come home," she said. "The least we could do was leave the place set." Clem didn't say anything. One of them said it once, the following winter, sitting at the mill. "I keep thinking about the table. The 2 plates, one with food on it, one empty." Nobody said anything for a moment. "He was expecting himself," one of them said. "He came home. He set a place for himself." "Or he set a place for whoever had been there before him," another said. "And sat in the other chair." They thought about that. "The chair that was pulled back," Clem said. "Like someone had just stood up from it." They sat with it. "Or like someone was going to sit down," Florrie said, "and was waiting." The cabin stood empty through the spring and into the summer. The axe was still there in April, standing at the north corner where Gideon had set it down, handle up, the way you'd set something down if you were planning to come back for it. Nobody moved it. Nobody moved to claim the land either. Gideon had no close family anyone could find. People left it alone, the way you left alone something that had its own business. In the fall, a family from the eastern part of the county looked at it for settlement. The man walked the property, looked at the cabin, went inside. He came out after a few minutes with a specific expression that his wife recognized. Not fear exactly, but the cousin of it. The face a person made when they understood something they hadn't been told. She didn't ask him about it until they were back on the road. "What?" she said. He thought about it for a moment. "It's a fine cabin," he said. "Good construction. The land is decent." "But," she said. He looked back at it. The cabin sat in its clearing, door closed, windows dark, exactly as it had sat all year. "Someone's been there," he said. "Recently. The floor near the fireplace." He paused. "It was warm." "Animals," she said. He didn't answer. She looked at the cabin, at the closed door. They did not settle the Aldred property. Nobody ever did. The first snow of that winter came in November. Clem Poole rode past the Aldred clearing on his way to his trap line, the way he always did, the way he had ridden past it every week for 30 years. He stopped at the gate. There were tracks in the snow, fresh, deep, one set, a man walking alone from the tree line to the cabin door. No tracks leading away. He sat on his horse and looked at them for a long time. The tracks were recent, an hour old, maybe less. The same stride, the same direction. North timber to the door, direct, purposeful. A man who knew the ground under the snow. He did not get down from his horse. He thought about Gideon, about a man who had worked this ground his whole life and had always come home, and was coming home still. Then he turned his horse south and rode. When he got home that evening, his wife was at the table, and she looked at his face and said, "You saw them again." "Yes," he said. "The same?" she said. "The same," he said. "Tree line to the door. Nothing going out." She poured him coffee. "You didn't go to the door," she said. "No." "Good," she said. "Some things don't need checking twice." He looked at her. "You think it's him?" he said. "I think it's what comes home," she said. "Whether that's him or the part of him that knew the way, I can't say. But it comes back every year when the first snow is right." She paused. "I think it needs to be left alone." They sat in the kitchen, and the fire burned. He told people what he'd seen. Plain, in order, without adding to it. People heard it. It did not become a ghost story. It became something more like local knowledge, the kind of thing you told a newcomer not to frighten them, but to orient them. The kind of thing that helped you understand the shape of the country you were living in. Every year after the first snow, someone would ride past the Aldred place. Not every year. Not without exception. But often enough, and always the same. A single path from the north tree line to the door. No tracks coming back. And no one in the valley ever waited to see where it went next. Some things were understood to have their own business. A man coming home to his own cabin in the dark, in the first snow, in the country where he had lived his whole life, was one of them. Gideon Aldred's cabin stood for 19 more years. The land was never settled. The door was never barred from the inside again, because after the spring thaw, no one had barred it. Florrie Pratt had set the table and straightened the cabin and replaced the bar. And every spring when she went to check on things, the bar was back up. She stopped replacing it herself after the 3rd year. She just went to check, and the bar was there, and she went home. But every first snow, it was barred. Every first snow, the tracks came. Not always. Not every year, without exception. But enough years that the absence of tracks in a given first snow was noticed too, was talked about, wondered at, held alongside the years when they had been there. People had theories about the years without tracks. Some said it depended on the weather, the temperature, the quality of the snow, something about the conditions that made it possible or not. Some said it depended on something else entirely, something they didn't have a word for. Clem's wife said once, in the last year of her life, "I think some years he rests." Just the bar, lifted into its bracket, the way a man did it from inside before he went to bed. If this story stayed with you, there are more waiting. Subscribe, and come back tomorrow. These are the stories from the edges of the recorded world.